Okay, so February 24th, 2022, think back to that day
Yeah.
for a second.
Yeah.
Russia launches this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And, I mean, talk about a seismic event. You know,
Yeah.
this plunges Europe into its biggest armed conflict since World War II. I mean, we all saw those images,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Cities being bombarded, millions of people fleeing a whole nation fighting for its very survival. And, I mean, almost immediately, the West, the U.S., NATO, the EU, everybody jumps in with this huge wave of support, sending billions in military aid, offering financial help, sharing intelligence. I mean, they even slapped Russia with all these crippling sanctions.
Yeah, it definitely felt like a decisive moment for a lot of people. I think the initial reaction was just pure moral outrage.
Right.
But as this conflict drags on and the scale of Western involvement is just ballooned. I mean, we're talking over $200 billion in military aid alone. It really begs the question for you, the listener, the one who's really trying to get a deeper understanding of what's really driving this massive support. I mean, is it really all about those democratic values and upholding international law like we hear so often? Or are there other, more concrete factors at play here, maybe even some benefits for the countries that are providing all this aid?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that is
Yeah.
precisely what we're going to unpack today, because when you look at the sheer scope of this assistance and how long it's been going on, it's kind of crucial to, look beyond those surface explanations.
I agree.
So we're going to do a deep dive today. We're going to look at that historical context that led up to this whole thing. We'll explore all those different reasons for the West's support. Everything from the idealistic ones to the strategic ones to maybe even some economic advantages that are kind of lurking in the background.
Yeah.
We're going to examine the role of the defense industry, look at the specific types of support that are being provided. What are the strategic gains, the economic gains, the political gains for the West? And of course, we got to talk about the controversies, the complexities, all the baggage that comes with this level of involvement.
Absolutely. And to really grasp the situation in Ukraine, you got to rewind a bit.
Yeah.
Our sources, they really emphasize that Ukraine's position has always been this delicate balancing act between East and West.
Oh, totally.
Especially since they got their independence back in 1991. And, things really got ramped up with the Euromaidan Revolution in 2014. That was a clear signal that Ukraine was leaning towards the West.
Yeah.
And then what happens? Russia annexes Crimea, and you have that conflict break out in the Donbas region. That was their response.
Right.
So this full-scale invasion in 2022, it wasn't some isolated event. This was a major and brutal escalation of an already simmering conflict.
Right. So that historical backdrop, it's absolutely crucial for understanding why the West reacted so strongly in 2022.
Exactly.
And one of the main justifications that we see pop up in all of our sources is this idea of defending international norms.
Yeah.
When you think about it, the whole global order since World War II, it's been built on this idea of respecting borders,
Yeah.
non-aggression.
Yeah.
If a powerful country can just waltz in and invade their neighbor without any serious consequences, what does that say about the stability of the entire system, right?
Yeah, it's a recipe for chaos.
I mean, it could totally erode the very foundation of international law.
Yeah, that's a core part of the West's argument.
Yeah.
If you allow this blatant violation of a country's sovereignty, you're setting a really dangerous precedent.
Right.
It could embolden other countries with their own, expansionist agendas to do the same thing.
Oh, yeah, copycats.
Exactly. And that would just completely undermine the rules-based international order that we have. And as you said, it's imperfect, but it's helped keep some semblance of peace for decades.
Right. It's that whole you break it, you buy it kind of thing.
Exactly.
And then there's this strategic imperative of containing Russia, right? I mean, a lot of people in the West, they see Russia as this expansionist power that's always looking to grab more territory.
Yeah, that perception is definitely out there.
And for a lot of NATO members, especially the ones that share a border with Russia, that fear is very real.
It's not just theoretical for them.
Right. It's their backyard. So supporting Ukraine, it becomes this way to push back against that perceived threat without, having to send their own troops into direct combat.
Right. It's a proxy conflict in a way.
Yeah.
It lets NATO apply pressure on Russia without, triggering Article 5.
Right. Which is that.
That's the collective defense clause that would mean, all of NATO has to jump in militarily.
Right. Full-blown war.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this way they can, weaken Russia's military, put a strain on their economy without risking that, catastrophic direct confrontation between nuclear powers.
Right. It's like walking a tightrope.
Yeah, a very high-stakes tightrope.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit, because beyond all this strategic stuff,
Yeah.
our sources also point to this really strong values-based argument. this whole defending democracy thing.
Right, the good versus evil narrative.
Yeah, Ukraine, it might have its internal issues, but it's often portrayed as this, plucky democracy standing up to this big, bad authoritarian regime in Russia.
Yeah, David versus Goliath.
Right. And, Western leaders, they love to frame this conflict as this fundamental clash of ideologies, democracy versus authoritarianism.
And that message, it really resonates with people in Western democracies.
Oh, yeah.
There's this powerful moral dimension to it, right?
Oh, yeah.
Supporting a country that's fighting for its right to exist, to choose its own path. To have those democratic institutions.
It tugs at the heartstrings.
It really does. It taps into those core beliefs about freedom and the rule of law and all that good stuff.
Okay, but here's where things get even more interesting, because we're going to move beyond those nice-sounding idealistic and strategic reasons.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty.
Right. Our sources, they highlight this whole protecting economic and energy interests angle.
Right.
Because Ukraine, it's not just some buffer zone on a map. It's a country with a ton of resources.
Yeah, it's got a lot to offer.
They're a major grain producer. They got natural gas reserves. They even have those critical minerals like lithium and those rare earth elements that are essential for all our fancy tech.
Absolutely. And if Russia were to gain control over all of that stuff, it would be a huge boost to their global economic power.
Oh, yeah. Game changer.
Think about it. Ukraine's a major grain exporter.
Right.
If Russia controls that, they have leverage over global food security, food prices, that's a big deal.
Huge.
And then access to all those minerals, that strengthens Russia's industrial base. So from the West perspective, supporting Ukraine, it helps keep those global supply chains diverse. And it prevents Russia from monopolizing all those key resources.
Right. It's like playing a game of Risk.
Yeah, global addition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this brings us to this aspect that doesn't always get a lot of attention. The role of the military-industrial complex.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Whenever there's a major conflict, or even just, this level of sustained military aid, we're talking massive amounts of money.
Oh, yeah.
And a big chunk of that ends up in the pockets of defense contractors.
It's an industry that thrives on conflict, unfortunately.
Right. And the numbers are just staggering. I mean, companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon BAE Systems, Rheinmetall, Northrop Grumman, they've all seen their profits and their stock values just skyrocket since this whole thing started.
Yeah, the demand for weapons systems, everything from javelins to HIMARS to Patriot missiles, artillery, drones, ammunition, it's all through the roof.
It's a feeding frenzy.
Yeah, and it's not just about selling off old stockpiles. This is about brand new production contracts, long-term commitments.
So who exactly benefits from this whole economic boom? I mean, obviously you've got the CEOs, the shareholders of these defense companies, they're raking it in.
They do all right.
But the influence, it goes way beyond that, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You got politicians, lawmakers, especially in places like the U.S., who control those defense budgets.
Right.
And some of these folks, they might have investments in these companies, or they're getting campaign contributions, lobbying support, all that stuff.
It's a cozy relationship.
Yeah. It's a very complex system. And there's this built-in incentive to keep that defense spending high, even if the threat changes.
It's like a self-perpetuating machine.
Yeah. It's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about the long-term drivers behind all this.
It's that whole revolving door thing, right?
Exactly.
People going back and forth between government, military roles, and jobs at these corporations, using their connections, their insider knowledge.
It's a tangled web.
Yeah. And, this whole military industry complex, it's not a new thing.
No, Eisenhower warned us about it way back in the day.
Right.
And the Ukraine war, it's basically amplified everything about it.
Yeah.
The scale, the impact, it's all been supercharged.
So Western leaders, they might be motivated by those, idealistic reasons, the strategic stuff that we talked about.
Yeah.
But they're also operating within this system where this massive industry has a ton of influence and a huge financial stake in keeping that money flowing.
They're not operating in a vacuum, that's for sure.
Okay, so let's talk about the specifics of how the West is actually helping Ukraine. Because it's not just about sending weapons, right?
No, it's a multi-pronged approach.
Yeah.
Military aid, that's the biggest piece of the pie. Obviously, over $200 billion in commitments from the U.S., the EU, and a bunch of other allies.
Yeah.
We're talking everything from guns and ammo to those high-tech anti-tank systems, air defense systems, tanks, artillery, the whole
The
shebang.
whole 9 yards.
And it's not just about the hardware. NATO is also providing training logistical support to help Ukraine actually use all this stuff effectively.
Right.
Then you've got the financial and humanitarian assistance that's meant to keep their economy from collapsing, to support those essential services, to help rebuild all the infrastructure that's been destroyed, and of course to provide aid to all the millions of people who've been displaced by the war.
Right.
And then you can't forget about the sanctions. Those are a big part of the strategy. They're designed to weaken Russia's economy and make it harder for them to keep fighting.
So all this support, it's been absolutely vital for Ukraine to hold on and even push back in some areas.
Oh, yeah, no doubt.
But our sources, they also suggest that the West is getting some pretty sweet benefits out of this whole deal.
It's not just a one-way street.
Right. So let's start with the strategic advantages.
Well, one of the biggest wins for the West is that they're weakening a major geopolitical rival, Russia, without having to put boots on the ground.
Right.
By supporting Ukraine, NATO countries are essentially degrading Russia's military capabilities and putting a strain on their economy without risking their own troops in direct combat.
Yeah, it's a low-risk, high-reward kind of situation.
Exactly. It's a way to project power to limit Russia's influence without paying that heavy price in terms of, Western lives and resources.
In this whole conflict, it seems like it's really breathed new life into NATO.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Before the invasion, there was all this talk about whether NATO was even relevant anymore in the 21st century.
Right, it seemed like a relic of the Cold War.
Yeah. But the war in Ukraine, it's like it gave them a purpose.
Yeah.
It brought them together. Even historically neutral countries like Sweden and Finland, they decided to join up.
Yeah, that's a huge shift, and it has major long-term implications.
It's a total game changer.
The war has really bolstered NATO's eastern flank, and it's shown that they're serious about collective defense.
Right.
And all those increases in defense spending across Europe, that's another sign that they're prioritizing security.
So on the economic front, we've already talked about how the defense industry is making a killing.
Oh, yeah, they're laughing all the way to the bank.
But are there other broader economic benefits for the West from all this?
Definitely, it's not just about weapons sales.
Right.
All that increased defense spending, it creates jobs in manufacturing, it drives innovation, and it strengthens those interconnected supply chains.
The ripple effect.
Yeah. And the war has basically created this long-term demand for Western military hardware across Europe and potentially in other parts of the world, too.
Right. It's like a whole new market has opened up.
And then there's the energy angle.
Yeah.
Europe used to be heavily dependent on Russia for energy.
Right.
But now that's been disrupted, and that's opened up lucrative markets for alternative sources, especially liquefied natural gas from the U.S.
American companies are loving it.
Oh, yeah. It's a big win for them.
So politically, how has this whole thing played out for the West on the global stage?
Well, by stepping up and supporting Ukraine and condemning Russia, Western countries have probably boosted their soft power, their international reputation,
Right.
especially among countries that are trying to figure out how to navigate their relationships with both the East and the West.
Right. They want to be on the right side of history.
Exactly. It allows them to project this image of moral leadership,
Right.
standing up for international norms and sovereignty.
Right.
And that unified stance, it can give them more diplomatic clout in international forums.
Strength in numbers.
Exactly. But it's not all sunshine and roses.
Right.
Our sources, they also point out some serious challenges and potential downsides to all this support.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a free lunch.
That's for sure. I mean, the economic strain on Western nations, it's becoming a bigger and bigger issue.
Sure.
With inflation going crazy, the cost of living going up, and all this public debt piling up in a lot of countries, people are starting to ask some tough questions about sending billions of dollars overseas.
Right. Charity begins at home.
Exactly. And we're also seeing this rise of what some are calling aid fatigue as the war drags on without a clear end in sight.
Right.
There are more and more voices calling for a diplomatic solution and more scrutiny of where all that aid is going and whether it's actually working.
And of course, there's always that looming risk of escalation.
Yeah, that's the big one.
As Ukraine gets more advanced weapons, as NATO gets more involved in training and intelligence, sharing the chances of something going wrong, a miscalculation, a deliberate escalation that could drag everyone into a wider war. It's a terrifying thought, and it's something that policymakers have to be thinking about constantly.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking about the potential for a conflict between nuclear powers. That's not something you want to mess around with.
No kidding. And then there are all the questions about transparency and accountability.
Yeah, where's all this money going?
Right.
How are they using all this equipment? Are there enough safeguards to prevent corruption, to make sure the aid is actually getting to the people who need it and being used for its intended purpose?
Right. Those are legitimate concerns.
Absolutely crucial questions.
So here we are, this war is still raging.
Yeah.
Ukraine has shown incredible resilience. They've managed to take back some of their territory, but a lasting peace, it still seems so far away.
It's a long road ahead.
Russia's dug in deep in those occupied regions. Western support,
Mm-hmm.
it's still flowing, but like you said, it's facing more and more scrutiny and debate.
Yeah, the tide might be turning.
It really feels like this conflict is a major test of the West's values, but it's also this arena where they're pursuing strategic interests and economic opportunities, maybe even necessities for some of them.
It's a complicated mix of motivations.
Yeah, and that line between genuinely helping a country defend itself and maybe fueling a war that benefits certain people financially, it's a very blurry one.
It's a moral gray zone for sure.
So we've talked about all those immediate consequences, the strategic stuff, the economic stuff, the political stuff. But what I find really fascinating is what happens next.
Yeah, the long game.
What are the ripple effects of all this on the global stage? How will this reshape alliances, trade relationships, the way we think about conflict in the future? These are the questions that we should be asking ourselves even after the fighting stops.
Absolutely, because the impact of this war, it's going to be felt for generations to come.
It's a turning point in history.
It really is.